What's up guys, my name is Ace, and one of the brand new mechanics they introduced with Modern Warfare 3 is Tac Stance. And while the basics of Tac Stance are pretty easy to understand, I wanted to dive a whole lot deeper to find out exactly how Tac Stance works, and in addition to this, after all of the testing that I've done, I wanted to share a good handful of tips when using Tac Stance. And diving right in, for those that are completely unfamiliar, Tac Stance is sort of an in-between hip firing and aiming down sights, so you won't get fully aimed down sight and pinpoint accurate to the center of your screen, but you will just get like a significantly tighter version of hip fire when in this Tac Stance, which you have full control over with a toggle. Additionally, when in a Tac Stance, you get fewer downsides that you would see with aiming down sights. And let's have a look at these important differences. The first difference comes with aiming down sight itself. When we sort of aim down sight with Tac Stance, we're not technically aiming down sight, we end up with a roughly 10 to 20% faster aim down sight time than if we were fully aiming down sight with that gun, so you can get into that tightest Tac Stance spread possible faster than a full aim down sight. Although this isn't really like a massive improvement. Like I said, it's only about 10 to 20% depending on the gun that you're using. However, another interesting characteristic with Tac Stance compared to fully aiming down sight is when you're in Tac Stance, your field of view doesn't change at all compared to hip firing, so you don't actually zoom in with your screen at all. Whereas with a full aim down sight, even if you're just using iron sights, you are going to get a little bit of a zoom. You'll notice the field of view tightens a little bit, and that could be a pro or a con depending on the situation. Oftentimes in really close quarter situations, you don't want that additional zoom, whereas in other situations, you do want to be able to zoom in fully, and therefore fully aiming down sight is obviously better for longer ranges. So that's the first big difference between fully aiming down sight and Tac Stance aim down sight. The second, and arguably the most important one here, is our aim down sight strafe speed, our ability to maintain mobility while in a Tac Stance compared to when we're fully aiming down sight. And I'm just going to fade between clips here with 3 different guns that I tested. I chose an assault rifle, an LMG, and an SMG, so you can see how fast you strafe with hip fire, Tac Stance, and aim down sight. And what I found with this is your Tac Stance aim down sight strafe speed is going to be roughly 6 to 12% slower than your hip fire strafe speed, which is great. That's a very small reduction to your movement speed while still getting that tighter and more accurate spread compared to hip firing, especially when we compare that to fully aiming down sight, where depending on the gun, aiming down sight and strafing will slow you down by about 20 to 40% compared to just hip firing. So this is where we're really starting to see a very noticeable advantage using Tac Stance. You can strafe side to side in a gunfight quite a bit faster in Tac Stance compared to aiming down sight. And I would say this is the primary reason to be using Tac Stance, is so you can strafe faster in a gunfight. It's not the only benefit, but for most guns at least, it's the primary benefit with Tac Stance. As for another benefit with Tac Stance, this has to do with sliding and shooting. By default, when you slide and try to aim down sight and fire at the same time, you'll actually automatically go into a Tac Stance, and that can be very useful. It's much better than trying to hip fire while sliding. And if you wanted to do this same thing while fully aiming down sight, you have to use Tactical Pads boots, which are generally not the best choice for you in the boots category. Now, of course, it's not fair to be looking at the upsides without also looking at the downsides of Tac Stance. Of course, you are going to be a lot less accurate than fully aiming down sight. There's obviously a noticeable bloom here, but at least you get the indicators to see how big that bloom is going to be. And it's also worth noting that as you continue firing, that spread will increase up to a maximum value. And obviously, when you compare this to fully aiming down sight, it's nowhere close to as accurate as aiming down sight. So obviously, Tac Stance isn't really designed to be used for really long-range engagements. But in saying that, with most guns, if you use the right attachments and you really tighten up that Tac Stance spread with your attachments, you can still have a pretty accurate gun on your hands that still kills surprisingly well at like mid to longer ranges. And this brings me to the next section of the video. I wanted to point out some key attachments you want to be looking for if you're trying to create a Tac Stance build. I'm primarily going to be focusing on the universal attachments that are going to apply to at least most of the guns in the game. And the first one to point out here is the Stovall DR Laser. And the nice thing about this one, while it doesn't technically give you the best possible Tac Stance spread in the laser category, it still really improves it significantly, and it's not a visible laser. You could technically get a little bit tighter, but then you've always got that laser visible, and that's often not ideal, so that's why I would lean more in the direction of this one. Then in the muzzle category, you want to keep an eye out for the S37C DL Breacher. This one's typically going to give you the best tactical stance spread in the muzzle category. And then for the underbarrel, you want to keep an eye out for the Bruin Bastion as well as the Cronin Groove Shot. Both of these are incredible for your Tac Stance spread. And that's pretty much it for the universal ones that you'll see on at least the vast majority of the guns in the game. On top of that, it is quite common that you'll see a rear grip that helps with Tac Stance as well as a stock, but that part will vary a lot more on a gun-to-gun basis. And with that, let's move into the final section of this video, and this is just general tips that I found with Tac Stance to help you get you on your feet. The first thing to point out that's excellent about Tac Stance is it's often in your best interest to hip fire as you're in the process of transitioning into a Tac Stance. Now, obviously you can do that with a full aim down sight as well, but I would say it's a lot more situational with a full aim down sight because you often don't want to end up in a situation where the initial recoil as you're going into aim down sight, where you're going to be quite inaccurate anyway, that'll end up throwing you off, so then your first shots that are fully accurate end up missing as well, and they have to compensate for the recoil. With Tac Stance, you don't have to worry about that nearly as much. The moment you see your target and you've got them reasonably centered, you start firing as you transition into Tac Stance, and it'll just get tighter and more accurate as you go. Additionally, when it comes to your settings, you may want to play around with these a little bit. One of the big settings that a lot of people have found they really enjoy on controller is in order to toggle into a Tac Stance, you have to be aiming down sight and then you hit the melee button rather than the down button on the directional pad. Additionally, I would recommend looking at your Tac Stance sensitivity and perhaps adjusting that a little bit depending on preference. Obviously, this is going to be highly subjective, but for me at least, just as an example here, I like having my Tac Stance sensitivity below 1 so I gain a little bit more precision when I transition into Tac Stance, but I also like that multiplier to be higher than I would normally use when aiming down sight. So for me, my aim down sight multiplier is 0.75, and I like my Tac Stance multiplier at about 0.8 to 0.85, so not quite as much of a slowdown as fully aiming down sight. Obviously, that's what works for me. I'm not saying you necessarily have to copy that. It's just something that I think you should at least consider and play around with. After that, let's talk a little bit about shotguns and Tac Stance, because this is an area where you can really heavily take advantage of Tac Stance. And here's just a great example. With the Lockwood 680, I've got no attachments on this build. The first test is going to be hip firing, second test is fully aiming down sight, and the third test here is with Tac Stance. And as we can see, fully aiming down sight is going to give us the best and most consistent pellet spread possible, but Tac Stance is still pretty good in this area. It's definitely going to be tightening it up, noticeably better than hip fire. So it's not a bad option by default. However, I wanted to show the potential with this. If you build for a Tac Stance spread, for the best Tac Stance possible on the Lockwood 680, this changes things because now our Tac Stance spread is actually tighter than our aim down sight spread. It is possible to do that with shotguns, which makes them even more consistent in a Tac Stance compared to fully aiming down sight. So this is something you may want to play around with a little bit with shotguns because it can really significantly boost the effectiveness of your gun. But then after that, just a few miscellaneous tips here with Tac Stance in general. I often find that Tac Stance is best suited to high fire rate guns. Odds are you're going to be missing a few shots here or there, and with a higher fire rates, it's going to be a lot more forgiving for any missed shots compared to a low fire rate weapon. And then to go along with that, I often recommend using a bigger magazine just so you can spray and pray a little bit more with that Tac Stance. And with that, that's going to wrap it up for today's video on a full breakdown of the Tac Stance mechanic in Modern Warfare 3. Overall, I've got to say I'm starting to come around to this mechanic a lot more now that I'm understanding it better. My initial impression of it was it's kind of neat, but also a little bit gimmicky, and I never really saw myself using it. But now that I've played around with it a lot more and actually created some Tac Stance specific builds, I'm really starting to see some value in this, at least as a change of pace. I still don't see myself really toggling between Tac Stance and aiming down sight like on the fly in a game, but at least now I am going to be integrating more Tac Stance only gameplay, where I build the gun specifically for that and I just never fully aim down sight. Now, of course, these are just my thoughts, and I'd love to hear what you guys think about the Tac Stance mechanic in those comments down below. Do you guys really like the introduction of Tac Stance, or not so much? Do you just not really interact with it at all? If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.